In the last part of this lecture, we'll explore parasitism from an evolutionary perspective. When we're looking at these examples, what I want you to remember is what is required for evolution to occur. Heritability, variation, and selection. We talked about ecological niches in the previous part. Now let's look at how parasites can take advantage of these niches. Let's look at the hookworm, a nematode larva very similar to what happens in the guinea worm. But this time, we'll look at this from an evolutionary perspective. The hookworm larva enters the mammal's body through its skin on the feet. It then moves through the body through the blood vessels, which finally gets it into the lungs, where it crawls into the trachea, is then swallowed by the animal, and ends up in the digestive system, where it can reproduce. Now, I realize that this is weird, and you're likely asking, well, how could something like this evolve? Well, ancestral nematodes used to parasitize fish, and the pathway was a simple one through which they climb through the gills, up into the mouth, and into the stomach. Hookworms jumping from fish to mammals was possible because the life cycle already existed in fish. It was unable to move into mammals because there was enough variation in the behavior and life cycle that allowed it to complete this more circuitous route and still survive in mammals. Evolving this behavior and exploiting this new mammal, well, it was only possible because there was enough variation in the behaviors that the nematode was able to find its way through the generations of selection. Pretty neat, right? But despite me telling you stories of all these really cool parasites, they aren't always winning. Because if they were, more of us would be walking around with more parasites. With any parasite, the goal is to extract as much energy from the host as quickly as possible. And from a host perspective, well, that's bad. So hosts are always trying to respond to the threat that parasites are present. What that means is there's always a co-evolutionary arms race. The host is trying to defend itself from the parasite, and the parasite is trying to evolve new ways of breaking through the host's defenses. Again, during this example, I want you to think about the 3 different factors that are needed for evolution to happen. Now let's look at this famous example of a co-evolutionary arms race between heliconius butterflies and passiflora vines. There are thousands of species of passiflora vines, and their flowers are really, really pretty, kind of alien looking. They're pollinated by a number of different animals, and they also taste delicious to caterpillars of the genus Heliconis. Females lay their eggs on the underside of the leaves of these passiflora vines, and when the eggs hatch, they eat the leaves. But obviously this is bad for the plant, and you can imagine that this creates a strong selective pressure because plants with no leaves can't get enough energy to reproduce. So this is where variation comes into play. Some of the plants vary in certain traits that makes them less susceptible to butterflies laying their eggs on their leaves. And one of these traits was leaf shape. If you look at some passiflora species, they have leaves that are of all kinds of different shapes. And this makes it more difficult for butterflies to recognize a passiflora vine based on its shape. So that means that any plant that has weird leaves could have a less chance of getting eggs laid on it. But of course, some butterflies would have found a new way to locate these plants, ignoring leaf shape. So having leaves of different shapes was not enough. This is where some species of passiflora vines evolved little yellow structures that mimic the eggs of the butterflies. The benefit to the plant was that it already looked like some butterflies laid some eggs there, so the butterflies would avoid that leaf, so there's less competition on their larvae, and it would remain unparasitized. But then, of course, the butterflies would learn to recognize the difference between real and fake eggs. And this co-evolutionary arms race has resulted in the evolution of a number of different traits in the plants, like chemical defenses, the plants attracting ant protectors, mimicking a pathogen infection on the plant. All of these things are to prevent parasitism. And in response, the parasite is co-evolving counter-adaptations to be able to use the plant more efficiently. Let me give you another example in real time from one of my favorite TV shows, Futurama. Here we have Fry learning about the co-evolution of 2 different powerful beings in the show. And when you watch this, I want you to think about this from an evolutionary perspective.
Let me tell you a story.
This
A
is where we
story
get
of
to learn
2
about the 2
alien
beings.
species so ancient that compared to them, the human race is a mere college senior. On a distant planetoid, they evolved to cooperate in their quest to
Here they're first
survive.
introduced and working together.
Cooperation, because life is
I
a
want you
team
to take
sport.
note of what
But
Fry said
over
there. Think
time,
about that
one
later.
species evolved a better strategy. and an evolutionary
And you
arms
can
race
kind of see how the
began.
individuals are starting to take advantage of one another. Now, of course, it's a bit far-fetched, but it's fun to kind of look at and imagine. It is an example of a co-evolutionary arms race and how it can actually function. But of course, it may not function exactly.
That concludes the
like this.
audio-visual portion of our head
And what I
clunk
want you to
and
think about, and we're going to have a question about this later on, is what are some of the problems with what I've shown you here right now? But I do want to let you know that there's another name for this co-evolutionary arms race, which is called the Red Queen hypothesis. And this comes from when the queen tells Alice that it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. And that's what these arms races usually feel like, never-ending contests of individuals trying to take advantage of each other. So I hope you now understand how evolution plays a role in host-parasite interactions and how that can lead to the evolution of new traits and even speciation, and how it means that parasites can find new hosts.